Ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to get underway right now. I just wanted to let people know that those of you that have just come into the venue here and they're sitting in the gallery, just a bit of an explanation as to what's going on. In the last week, Metro Vancouver and the Capital Regional District have been hosting Special Park Districts Forum, and this is attended by leaders and professionals involved in the management of regional scale park systems from across North America. Most of the delegates here are from the US, but we have a few from Canada and some from regional districts here in British Columbia, and also some municipal staff have participated. What we wanted to do with this year's forum was to share with the public some of the things that are very important to us that align really well with some of the planning initiatives and some of the overarching strategic objectives that we have. And one of those in Metro Vancouver is the conservation of natural capital. And we're very honored here to have Dr. David Suzuki share his perspectives on elements of this. And as you can see, it was up earlier, the perspectives on a new bottom line for the 21st century. So I'm going to call on Peter Robinson to introduce our speaker tonight. Peter Robinson is the Executive Director for the David Suzuki Foundation, and he's also a member of the Board of Directors for the Pacific Parklands Foundation, who have helped and have partnered with us in helping to put this forum together. And again, thanks very much to the PPF for their support. It's appreciated. So Peter.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Stephen. Now, as Stephen said, I head up the David Suzuki Foundation, but that's not my role tonight in introducing our speaker, Dr. David Suzuki. I am, in fact, representing the Pacific Parklands Foundation as a director, and the Parklands Foundation is a partner in this Special Parks District Forum that Stephen just told you about. Now, I want to begin by acknowledging, of course, that we are on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, or what Hereditary Chief Larry Grant of the Musqueam Nation calls the largest clear-cut with the most invasive species in the province. Now let me just ask, how many of you would self-describe yourselves as environmentalists? Put up your hands. I can't actually see. Actually, not that many. Now, if I had come, I would wager that if I went and interviewed every one of those who raised their hand, I would get a completely different meaning each time that I chatted with you. Environmentalism and environmentalist are words that encompass a really deep variety of beliefs and values, experiences, and outcomes. It includes people who are traditional conservationists, but it also includes folks who would have a radical, deep ecologist perspective. There are individuals who believe in green technology, and there are folks who believe that technology is part of the problem. It includes those who are pessimistic about the future and our ability to solve the problems we face, but it encompasses as well many, many who think that we can use our ingenuity to solve those problems. But at its heart, environmentalism has one common denominator. It is an understanding that we, the human species, are completely a part of the natural world. We are deeply embedded in it, and in fact, we are completely dependent upon it for our survival. And I say this because in my time working with David, I am only now really truly beginning to understand his profound understanding of what it means to be an environmentalist. Dr. Suzuki is probably, why am I calling you doctor for God's sake? Arguably the most recognizable Canadian. Award-winning scientist, geneticist, broadcaster. He has a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago. He's taught at the University of Alberta and at the University of British Columbia. Holds 25 honorary degrees, has written 52 books, Companion of the Order of Canada, distinguished broadcaster. He began, as many of you know, with Quirks and Quarks on CBC Radio, and he's hosted The Nature of Things since 1979. The recipient of numerous numerous awards, international and otherwise, medals, including the Right Livelihood Award, which is considered the alternative Nobel Prize. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Dr. Suzuki.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. He still hasn't learned that brevity is to be valued. It was far too generous. I am delighted, I'm honored to have the privilege of sharing a few thoughts with you this evening. But before I begin, I have to say that I'm here to address you as an individual citizen. I'm not representing any organization or any group. And I, like Peter, would like to acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people who've taken care of it for thousands of years. I speak to you today as an elder, and as an elder, I assure you I have no hidden agenda. Elders, I believe, are really important because they have something no other group in society has. They have lived an entire lifetime. And that lifetime has filled them with experiences. They've celebrated a few successes. They've made mistakes and had suffered with failures. They've learned a lot through that lifetime. And so I believe that it's time now for elders to enter the most important time in their lives, to troll through a lifetime of experience for those nuggets so dearly paid for of knowledge that we must try to pass on to the coming generations. And that's what I would like to try to do in the next few minutes. For the people sitting here at the dinner tables, let me say my daughter would say, "You are my peeps." That's what the work you do, I believe, is one of the most vital activities that we have in society today. You see, today's generation of young people is absolutely unique in all of human history. They spend the least amount of time outside of any generation in history. They have lost that deep connection with the natural world. You all know about this with decline. Well, I don't know how it is in a metropolitan area, but certainly in our provincial and our federal parks, attendance is declining. But I think the most telling statistic is that in Canada, the average child today spends 8 minutes outside and more than 6 hours in front of a television, computer, or iPhone screen. And it's not just kids. I have a friend in Toronto who lives on the northern edge of the city in a high-rise apartment that's completely air-conditioned. And he tells me he goes down the elevator in the morning, into the basement, into his car, which is air-conditioned, drives down the Don Valley Freeway to the basement of his commercial building, goes up to his office, completely air-conditioned. That office is joined by tunnels to huge shopping areas and grocery stores. He literally said to me, "David, I don't have to go outside for weeks." That's the kind of world that we are living in today. But you know, we only fight to protect what we love. And how on earth will we fight to protect nature if we don't even know the role that she plays in our lives? As Peter says, this is the understanding of environmentalism, that we remain utterly embedded in and dependent on nature for our survival and well-being. I grew up in London, Ontario in the 1950s. There were 4 children in my family, my mother as well as my mother and father, house of less than 1,000 square feet. And that was not an exceptionally small house. That was considered a normal house in those days, but it was a small house. So in my house, the constant refrain was, "David, go outside and play." "But Mommy, it's raining." "I don't care. Put your raincoat on, go over, get Bobby, and go outside and play." And we were outside. And anyone who has ever seen a child, even today, faced with a huge puddle, you can spend hours playing in a puddle. First of all, jumping in it, but you can make little canals down and join them with other tunnels, or you can dam them. And a puddle is just an absolutely amazing thing. And when I was growing up, around 5:30, you'd see back doors open, and moms and dads would be yelling for Johnny or Mary because we were out there. But of course, we haven't created an environment. We've got a very car-friendly environment in cities, but one that is not child-friendly. So our houses are bigger. There's a lot more room now. In the last 40 years, the average size of a Canadian house has more than doubled. And in that same time, the average size of a Canadian family has decreased by 50%. So that means the average person today in a new house has 4 times as much room as we did 40 or 45 years ago. And what do we need all that room for? Well, we got a lot of stuff to put in it, and Johnny or Mary can have their own area and do their own thing, because we don't want our kids to go outside, right? Because we're afraid that they might be hit by a speeding car, there might be a pervert lurking behind the bush, or they might pick up a discarded injection needle. Or we've made it very child unfriendly. When I was growing up in London, the elders were all sitting on the porches. They were our eyes and ears to what was going on in the neighborhood, and we didn't worry about the kids going outside. In order to get Canadians outside, which we believe is one of our great challenges, Peter and the David Suzuki Foundation dedicated May to what they call the 30 by 30 challenge. Will Canadians be willing to spend or attempt to spend 30 minutes a day outside for 30 days in the month of May? We threw in an extra day with 31 days. And when I first heard about the idea, I said, get serious. 30 minutes is nothing. Why don't we start with 2 or 3 hours a day? We got 10,500 Canadians, was it? And 250 companies and schools to sign up to take this challenge. And I had to tell a lot of people, listen, just because you go outside to smoke 6 times for 5 minutes, that doesn't count. You can't add up the little pieces, when you're going from a building to a car. No, it's got to be 30 solid minutes outside. And to my amazement, the way we live now, even for me, and I always think of myself as an outside guy, even for me, had to be dedicated. In fact, I missed 3 days out of the 31 days. 2 of the days I was sick in bed. But one of the days I had to fly from Portland to Boston and then get down over to MIT. And it turned out I was either in a hotel or a car or a plane for the entire day. We have to make an effort to get outside. And, we don't live in the right, we don't hold our meetings outside. Always got to be in an office. We don't have in-person conversations. Hey, let's go outside and talk or walk while we talk. And we don't have lunches or coffee breaks outside. And I think that we've got to start thinking about the way that we live in such a way that being outside is a part of our daily lives. You all know, I know that there's no need to explain to you that we need to be in the company of other species. A city is a place that is so homogenized now, it's basically a monoculture of human beings. Very, very few other species around us. E.O. Wilson at Harvard has coined the word biophilia, a love of life. And he believes, and I agree with him, that we have a built-in, a genetic need to be with other species, to be out with nature. Richard Love, in his book, The Last Child in the Woods, describes what he calls nature deficit disorder. That is, a number of behavioral problems are like bullying and attention deficit are cropping up because he believes we're not getting outside in the presence of other species. Now there are whole books that have come out showing the benefits, the mental, the physical benefits of being outside or even being in the view of trees and other species. So I'm not going to to stress, but I think the justification for parks is very clear. We need to have parks as places in cities where we can encounter other species, and the physical and psychological impact, benefits of that are unquestioned. The science demonstrates that. Years ago, when we were fighting over one of the watersheds to stop logging or prevent logging, I encountered the CEO of the logging company that was given a license by the provincial government to log this watershed that we were trying to stop. And when he recognized me, we got into a rather animated discussion that very quickly elevated into a shouting match. And finally, in frustration, he said, "Listen, Suzuki, are you tree huggers willing to pay for those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay for those trees, they don't have any value till someone cuts them down." And that, for me, was an epiphany, because I realized that in the culture that we live in, he is absolutely right. And so environmentalists struggling to try to protect forests are left to saying, you know, the forest company can easily say, well, there's X number of board feet and X number of tons of pulp and so many jobs and so much profit. They can give you an itemized list of the economic benefits of logging that forest. And we're left with saying, well, if we wanted, we might be able to find some mushrooms and some berries, and maybe we could find some medicines in 10 or 15 years. And, ecotourism. But of course, this is absolutely terrible, because the real reason, the real benefits of the forest don't come in those economically definable ways. As long as those trees are standing and healthy, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air and putting oxygen back in. Not a bad service for an animal like us. If that wasn't happening, of course, we wouldn't be here. Those trees are extracting water out of the soil and transpiring that water into the air and affecting weather and climate. Those tree roots are clinging to the soil, so when it rains, that soil doesn't run into the spawning beds of the salmon. That forest is providing habitat for countless insects and fungi and birds and mammals, and all of those things are provided as services by that ecosystem, and yet from an economic standpoint, we can't quantify that or argue. And so it's really an uneven discussion when we enter into that kind of a debate. Environmentalists, I think, have struggled by being caught up in trying to argue through the same value system, trying to justify why we want to reduce greenhouse gases. Well, we'll save money by being more efficient, not using as much fossil fuel, and the air will be cleaner, so our health bills will be lowered. We're constantly forced to justify our position in economic terms. But the services performed by healthy ecosystems are not evaluated in the same way as one would derive from looking at it from strictly a resource management perspective. I try to discuss or demonstrate the value of nature in the following way. I want you to imagine that scientists have made an incredible breakthrough, that scientists have discovered time travel. And imagine that this room is a giant time machine. And this podium is my console, and all of the dials are here. And I'm going to dial back now 4 billion years back in the history of this planet. 4 billion years ago, there was no life on Earth. It was a sterile planet. So I've dialed back, I push a button, boom, we're back 4 billion years. And of course, we're all going to be anxious to see what was the world like before there was any life on it. So we open the door, run out, and of course, every one of us is dead as a doornail in less than 5 minutes. And the reason is, oxygen is a very highly reactive element. It's what causes rust. Oxidation breaks down compounds, so that oxygen is something you don't find in the atmosphere of Mars or anywhere like that, because it very quickly disappears. It was life. It was plants in the oceans and on land that took carbon out of the air and put oxygen back in, and over hundreds of millions of years transformed the atmosphere to the oxidizing atmosphere that animals like us depend on. Without life, there was no air for an animal like us to breathe, and to this very day, that's the role that plants perform in the waters and on land. Okay, so let's say that we knew that there was no atmosphere. So if you reach under your table, I put a big tank of compressed air under the table for every one of you, and there's a mask there. So put the tank on, put the mask on here, and turn on the tank, and now we've got air. Let's go. Okay, open the door, out we go. Well, before there was any life, there was a lot of carbon dioxide and water in the atmosphere. These are greenhouse gases. It's very warm out. So I would imagine after a few hours wandering around looking at the earth, you'd get thirsty. There's a lot of water around. Where would you find water that you could trust to drink? After all, that water is percolating through the rocks and dissolving all kinds of minerals and chemicals out of the surroundings. Where would we get water that we could drink? In Vancouver, we get our water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. And when the rain hits the trees and the other plant roots and the soil, fungi, and bacteria, they filter the water for us. Before there was any life on Earth, there was nothing to filter the water during that hydrologic cycle. Okay, so we knew that. Yeah, probably I'd drink it, but say you want to be a little safe. So I put a bottle of water for each of you under the table as well. A glass bottle, you don't want a plastic bottle, it'll ruin your sex life. So I gave you a glass. So we'll clip the glass bottle onto our helmet here, and there's a straw, and we can go out for a lot longer. After a few more hours, I would imagine you'd get hungry. Before there was any life on Earth, where was there anything that we could eat? In fact, everything that we eat for our nutrition was once alive. So before there was any life on Earth, there was nothing for an animal like us to eat. Okay, so we knew that, and I've got a huge pile of food packaged here. But let's suppose we're going to stay for a few weeks, and so I brought some radish seeds and lettuce seeds, and we're going to plant these seeds and have a little green, some fresh vegetables anyway. Where would you find, before there was any life on Earth, where would you find any soil to grow plants in? Soil is created by life. Before there was any life on Earth, there was a lot of clay, dust, sand, and gravel. There was no soil in which to grow our food. And finally, let's suppose the sun sets. It's still warm out, but we get kind of homesick and say, gee, let's light a fire and sit around and discuss what we've learned here. Where would you find anything to burn 4 billion years ago? Every bit of our fuel, wood, peat, dung, coal, oil, gas, all of that is created by life. Life captures the energy of the sun by photosynthesis and then stores it and ultimately accumulates it so that we can liberate it by burning. So again, no fuel before there was any life. Well, we brought some wood and paper, so let's crumple up some paper, put some kindling and wood on there, and then with a match, guess what? Before there was any life on Earth, there was no fire on the planet. In order to have fire, you need oxygen. There was no oxygen. So the point I'm trying to make is that with this great scientific breakthrough, we discover that without life, the planet is uninhabitable for an animal like us. Who needs nature? We all do, because it is nature that provides us with the most fundamental needs that we have to survive and flourish. Yet over and over again, we're told, listen, in this discussion or this argument, let's get to the bottom line. The bottom line is the economy is what determines our priorities. The economy is the bottom line. How on earth did we get to that moment of that perception? I'm a geneticist by training, and I've been amazed to see how geneticists have been able to use DNA, the genetic material, and trace the movement of our species across the planet. And all of the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. And I can't wait for the Ku Klux Klan to ask me to give a lecture. And I'm going to tell these pointy-headed characters, we're all Africans. We were all born in Africa. So, from Africa, then we spread across the planet. And for 95% of human existence, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. We carried everything we owned, and we followed plants and animals through the seasons. And if you're a nomadic hunter and gatherer, you know you are absolutely dependent on nature for your ability to survive and be okay. You know we are a part of the natural world. In the last 10,000 years, the last 5% of human existence, we underwent the agricultural revolution, which transformed the way humans live on this planet. In 1900, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. There were only 14 cities with more than 1 million people. London was the largest with 6.5 million people. Tokyo was the 7th largest city in the world with 1.5 million people. Most people in the world in 1900 still lived in rural village communities because we were still primarily an agricultural animal. If you look at a map of Canada in 1900, you would see the prairies dotted with villages of 100, 150, 200 people, all throughout the prairies, because we were still involved primarily in agriculture. And farmers understand the need or the necessity to pay attention to weather, to climate, and the seasons. They're utterly dependent for their well-being on those times of the year. Farmers know that the amount of snow in the winter is directly related to the amount of moisture in the soil in the summer. They know that we need insects to pollinate flowering plants. They know that certain plant species will take nitrogen out of the air and fix it as fertilizer in the soil. Farmers know that we are a part of nature. In only 100 years, we underwent another major transformation, comparable to the agricultural revolution. By the year 2000, there were now 6 billion people in the world, 4 times as many people, but there were over 400 cities with more than 1 million people. The 10 largest cities in the year 2000 all had more than 11 million people. Tokyo was the largest city in the world, 26 million people. Can you imagine? In 100 years, Tokyo went from 1.5 million people to 26 million people. And if you've ever been to Tokyo, you know humans shouldn't have to live this way. We didn't evolve to live in big cities in that way. But in 100 years, we have gone from being an agricultural creature to a big city dweller. And in a big city, our perspective changes very much. In a city, our highest priority becomes our jobs. You need a job to earn the money to buy the things that you want. And so the economy then becomes our highest priority. And we forget that the very word economy comes from the Greek word ekos, meaning household or domain. And ekos is the word from which ecology is derived. The study of our household or domain, our domain, because we're a species that's not fixed to a specific ecosystem, our domain is the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. And what ecologists try to do is study species to determine what are the critical elements, what are the conditions, the principles, the laws that enable a species to survive and flourish. Not a bad bit of information. I would have thought any group, any government, any corporation, before beginning a new program would say, wait, before we do this, what did those ecologists tell us? What are those conditions and principles of sustainability and long-term survival? But when we say, as our Prime Minister has said repeatedly, we can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's crazy economics. It'll destroy the economy to do that. When we say we have to clear-cut forests on a large scale, or we have to drag heavy weights and nets across the bottom of the ocean in order to be globally competitive, when we say that we have to spread pollution into the air, water, and soil because that's the price of doing business, we elevate the economy above the very things that keep us alive. How on earth did we get to this time and this perspective? I believe, this is just my kind of amateurish stab at answering that question, that we had, of course, this huge crisis as we were being transformed into big city dwellers. In 1929, we had the stock market crash. And that was followed by the Great Depression, and it was a terrible time for humanity. It was a very, very tough time for years. And what got us out of the Depression, of course, was World War II. Wars are great for getting economies going. You got to pump out planes and boats and guns and all this stuff, and it's great for the economy. And as the war went on, and the United States, the American president realized that we were going to win that war, his big dilemma was, what do we do in peacetime? How do we transform a wartime economy into a peacetime economy? And so Roosevelt established the Council of Economic Advisors to the president. And they were charged with telling the president what the peacetime economy would look like. And the solution came back: consumption. We have to make consumption an American way of life. Get Americans to buy stuff, use them up, throw them away, and buy more stuff. And when you introduce the concept of disposability, which I think is one of the most disgusting words that we should, when you hear someone say, I've got a disposable, you cover your kid's ears and say, don't listen to that man, he said a terrible word. But once you get disposability built in, so you use something once or twice and throw it away, you got a market that will never be fulfilled. You've got an endless market. And boy, did it work. 70% of the American economy today is fueled by consumption. And so after the terrible tragedy of 9/11, Mr. Bush's first speech to the American public included his request that I want you to go out and shop. So you see, our job now as citizens is to be consumers, because without our consumption, we are in deep economic trouble. And so we serve the economy to keep it going, but all of the stuff that we use in that economy comes out of the earth. And when we're finished with it, it will go back into the earth. And so it increased tremendously our ecological footprint. It takes a lot of air, water, and land to deal with the products and the productivity of our economy. It was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that came out in 1962 that made many people realize the repercussions of that rapid growth in the peacetime economy through consumption. Her book, Silent Spring, was all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. And I personally was just beginning my career as an assistant professor in 1962 when that book came out. And it profoundly impacted my life. Because what she showed was that we're a very clever creature. We can invent these powerful insecticides. But when we spray out on the fields to kill pests, we don't realize that everything in the world is connected to everything else. And so, yes, it does kill pests, but it kills all insects that come in contact with that compound, and it ends up affecting fish and birds and human beings. By the 1960s, breast milk in North American women was considered too toxic to feed to babies. Millions of us were swept up in the modern environmental movement as a direct consequence of Rachel Carson's book. And you know, when her book came out, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. The word environment didn't mean what it has come to mean today. But as a result of that environmental movement, we've got departments of the environment from the federal through the provincial to the municipal level. You simply can't ignore it as an issue. We have laws designed to protect the air, to protect water, to protect endangered species. And millions of hectares of land and some of the oceans are now protected as parks or reserves. And that was a consequence of this explosive growth in the environmental movement. And I remember celebrating victories that I was involved in various ways, in small ways, in fighting, you know, in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up in Alaska, right next to the Yukon. It's the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herds, one of the great gatherings of mammals in North America. And when the oil in the North Slope was found in Alaska, then eventually pressure came to drill for oil in ANWR, in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And each time the pressure came up, the Americans are going to put, they have a thing where you can put a rider on a bill going through and kind of sneak it in like a Trojan horse. That little rider then sneaks through Congress and you can pass it. And they would stick these riders trying to sneak through a proposal to drill for oil in ANWR. And I think we did 3 shows on the nature of things. Each time we heard there was pressure to drill, we'd do a show on the biology of ANWR and show the value of the porcupine caribou herd. And we beat back that pressure. There was a proposal to drill for oil in Hecate Strait. And I joined with the First Nations on the coastal communities, a group called OSAN. I don't know if there's anyone here that remembers OSAN, and I don't know what the acronym is for. But we then raised a lot of noise and stopped the proposal to drill in Hecate Strait. There was a proposal to build a dam at Site C on the Peace River, and we stopped that. There was a proposal to bring the oil from the North Slope of Alaska down the coast of British Columbia in supertankers to Seattle to be refined in Washington. And David Anderson was the leader of the Liberal Party in British Columbia. The Liberals in BC at that time were very, very different from the Liberals today. They were not Gordon Campbell, Christy Clark Liberals, but David Anderson was really a huge part of the success in stopping the transport of oil through British Columbia waters in supertankers. And my wife and I got very involved in the fight against a series of dams that was to be built in Brazil with a $500 million loan from the World Bank. And working with the Kayapo Indians in the Amazon in Brazil, we got the World Bank to withdraw its proposed loan to Brazil. So we celebrated these great events as great victories. And yet 35 years later, guess what? Every one of those issues is back on the agenda. Indeed, Brazil now said, we don't need a loan from the World Bank. Our economy's doing fine. We're going to build those dams on our own. And as you well know, the dam at Site C is now well on its way to getting started, although there's going to be a big fight, I believe, over that. But we're committed, I think, in British Columbia to building that dam to power the LNG plants that are also being proposed. So what does that mean then? We fought those battles and we thought we won them 30 years ago. And the reality is that we failed. Environmentalism has failed because we remained in the same arena. We remained within the same value and belief system, the belief that the economy was the dominant priority, and we argued within that same arena. We didn't shift the paradigm, as you hear this cliche. We didn't change the way we see ourselves on the planet. And we didn't see that what people have known for most of human existence, that we were totally embedded in and utterly dependent on nature for our well-being and our survival. You remember we set up round tables in British Columbia every time there were problems over logging or fishing well. The government would punt to get out of this dilemma by setting up a round table. And at the round table, all of the stakeholders would be brought to the table. Also the loggers and the tourism operators and all the native people. And so we thought we had all of the we're all stakeholders, for crying out loud. But every group of stakeholders would come with their own vested interests to fight for their share of whatever was being fought over. And it simply can't work because we haven't changed the paradigm. What is our absolute primary priority, our highest need that we have as a species? And this is something I tell children. You know, what was the very first thing you needed the moment you left your mother's body? And of course the answer is a breath of air. And from that moment on to the last breath you take before you die, you need air 15 to 40 times a minute. Pretty high priority. So I tell children, now I want you to take a deep breath, hold it, and don't take another breath for 5 minutes. I'm going to continue talking, and you just hold your... And you know, children are so innocent. You see them, they're turning bright red before they finally, of course, have to give in. And I tell them, air is so critical to your well-being that you cannot commit suicide by holding your breath. Your body will not allow you to do that. If you don't have air for more than 3 or 4 minutes, you're dead. If you breathe polluted air all the time, you're sick. So surely clean air should be the very highest priority we have, regardless of what your area of vested interest is. Can we not, as an organism, can we not agree that clean air is our highest priority? And of course, then I tell children, try going for a week. No, I shouldn't tell them that, I guess. Try going for a week without taking a drink. And of course, we couldn't do that because we would be dead if we didn't have water, because each one of us is between 60 and 70% water by weight. But the problem, of course, is that our bodies leak water, right? It comes out of our skin and our eyes and our mouth and our crotch, and we lose water all the time. And so we're constantly imbibing water. And where do we think that water comes from? It's not British Columbia water. It's just temporarily here in British Columbia. It's cartwheeling around the planet through the hydrologic cycle. And we just happen to be biological creatures that have become a part of the hydrologic cycle. Without water for more than a week or so, you're dead. If you have to drink polluted water, you're sick. So surely protecting clean water should be a high priority. And you can go down the list then. As biological creatures, we need food, and most of that comes from the soil. So again, protecting the soil and protecting diversity of life is critical. And every bit of the energy that we need to move and grow and reproduce, every bit of that energy is sunlight. Sunlight captured through photosynthesis in plants and converted into chemical energy, and we then acquire that by eating the plants or eating the animals that eat the plants. So when we need that energy, we then burn it in our bodies. That's why my mother calls me Sunny, because we're releasing the energy of the sunlight back out into the environment. So we are created by these absolutely critical elements. And if we don't begin our discussion about how we're going to live in the world, by all agreeing, those surely should be our greatest priority in protecting. Because without them, we can't live. And if we don't protect their cleanliness, we're sick. Air, water, soil, and sunlight through photosynthesis, and the diversity of plants and animals around the planet, that cleanse, replenish, and create those 4 sacred elements. Earth, air, fire, and water is what I've been taught by our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. So I believe that we have to stop all of this fighting. You're going to see a huge fight brewing now over the LNG plants. The huge fight over what we're going to do as a port. Are we going to ship coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel? Are we going to become a port for coal? These fights are going to happen. And I believe that if we don't leave our vested interests outside the door as we begin to discuss these issues, and all agree that our highest priority has got to be air, water, soil, biodiversity, sunlight, those are our greatest needs. And they must become the foundation of the way we live to protect those, because without them, we're either sick or we're dead. Then we begin to build how we live socially, how we create an economy that will protect, above everything else, those fundamental things. If we don't begin the conversation that way, I simply think it's going to be, we're going to fight these battles over and over and over. Well, can it be done? How much time do I have? When did I start? Sorry? Could I take 5 more minutes? So, can it be done? And I like to give a couple of examples of the kind of things that can be done in both Ecuador and Bolivia in South America. They have now enshrined Pachamama in the Constitution. Pachamama is Mother Earth. Now, it's not surprising in Bolivia that this would happen because the president of Bolivia is the first indigenous person, Evo Morales, elected to be head of a country. But Ecuador is a very interesting country. They are an oil exporting country. The president, Correa, has a PhD in economics from an American university. And when he was elected on the promise of rewriting the Constitution, he was the one that approved the inclusion of Pachamama in the Ecuadorian Constitution. So what does that mean? It means in Ecuador and Bolivia, trees and birds and fish all have a constitutional right to exist and flourish. Well, how does that play out then? In the southern part of Ecuador is a river called the Vilcabamba River. And the Vilcabamba is reputed to be a river whose waters are so pure, if you live on along the Vilcabamba, you will, and drink the Vilcabamba water, you'll live much longer, like 100 years or something. So, of course, what do you expect? Americans rush down there and move to Vilcabamba. There are dozens and dozens of Americans living along the shore. And one of them are Richard and Noreen, I can't remember their last name, 2 Americans that have about a 60-acre farm on the banks of the Vilcabamba. And they noticed that a road building company had come into the valley and was cutting a road on the side of the valley and dumping the rocks and soil and the trees into the Vilcabamba River. And of course, when the river gets narrower, the flow gets faster. And then there was a big rain and a flood that washed out half of their crops, their farming down there, of Noreen and Richard. So they sued the construction company on behalf of the Vilcabamba River. Now, when you sue on behalf of a river can't use any money. So you can't sue for money for the Vilcabamba River. You can only sue on behalf of the river, and they were suing to restore the river to its original state, and they won. So now the company is obligated to restore that river to its original state. So the enshrinement of Pachamama is very, very powerful in that country. Something else that they've done is absolutely astounding. Their big national park is a park called Yasuni. and it's on the east side of the Andes Mountains, right at the headwaters of the Amazon River. And for reasons I won't go into, this place was maintained unaffected by cold period, ice ages and warm periods. It stayed constant, and it has the highest level of biodiversity of any ecosystem on the planet. And I spent 4 days filming there, and I can tell you it is amazing. I mean, in one day you may see 6 species of monkeys, and birds, of course, of every sort, and insects. Anyway, it's an amazing park. 1 million hectares in Yasuni, and they discovered a huge deposit of oil under Yasuni. So President Correa, this economist, said, well, if we dig it up, we'll destroy the park, and nobody wants to do that. And if we then burn it, that'll simply add to more global warming. So why don't we leave it in the ground? $7 billion worth of oil will leave in the ground. And so he said, we're willing to leave it in the ground and take a hit for half the value of that oil. So we'll absorb $3 billion of the value of that oil. We'll forego that. But will the world help fund us for the other $3 billion? Will the world contribute to keeping the oil under the ground? Now, they set up an account in the United Nations, so the Ecuadorian government, as politics change, can't get into that and start looting that fund. The UN is administering it, and it will live on the interest of that fund to fund renewable energy in Ecuador, to fund the native communities that live in and around Yasuni Park, and to fund restoration and extension of the forest out into the areas that have already been destroyed by oil development. So they said, we are asking the world to contribute $300 million each year for the next 10 years. They've passed the first year, they got $300 million. So it's a very interesting experiment to see who will cough up the money and whether will be able to sustain it. Compare that with Canada. We have the second or third largest deposit of oil in the world in the Alberta tar sands. We're spending now billions of dollars. The only thing the federal government is investing in to deal with climate change is carbon capture and storage. But wait a minute now. Nature already did that. The tar sands are the carbon pumped out of the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years and stored. It doesn't make any sense to dig it up, liberate it back, and then try to capture it and put it back down. Geez, can we not be at least as original as Ecuador and say, let's leave it in the ground and find other ways? And of course, the example of what is possible as a shift is Bhutan. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Bhutan, but I know it's been very, very much publicized. But Bhutan is this tiny kingdom hidden deep in the Himalayan mountains, and it's surrounded by these very high ranges. They were able to stay hidden from the rest of the world for over 300 years. And they didn't want the Indians or the Chinese who were on either side of them to know they were there, so they just hunkered down. But in the 1950s, the king of Bhutan said, we better start sending people out and find out what's going on in the world. We can't just stay isolated. So in 1961, they sent 100 kids, not the top kids, chosen at random, out to schools in India. And then they started doing that every year, 100 kids. And then many of those went to Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Stanford and are now, the Prime Minister of Bhutan is now one of those first kids to go out. But as the kids went out to Indian schools to get educated, they started to come back to Bhutan and they said, you're not going to believe what people seem to think development is. They think development is about stuff and money. And that's why in 1971, the king of Bhutan was at a meeting in India, and a reporter asked him, how is Bhutan's GNP? And he answered, we're not interested in GNP in Bhutan, we're interested in GNH, gross national happiness. That the happiness of our people is what matters. And last year, Bhutan introduced the only resolution it's ever introduced to the United Nations. Their resolution asked that happiness of the people and the well-being of life should be the goals of government. 68 countries co-sponsored that bill, and it passed unanimously through the United Nations. So what they're saying is that happiness and well-being should be the goals of government. The economies should be to aid that goal. The economy growth, more and more money is not the goal. That should be a means to something else. And Bhutan is saying the ultimate goal is happiness and well-being of life. Bhutan is the only, first and only country in which all of its agriculture is completely organic. They have vowed to protect over 60% of their forests. What else? They're going to be 100% renewable energy. I think they are 100% renewable energy. They're doing it mainly by hydroelectricity. So they've got a lot of things going. This is a tiny kingdom, but they've got snow leopards, they've got rhinoceri, they've got hippos, elephants, leopards, they've tigers. Oh, sorry, maybe they don't have tigers. They have this amazing group of animals, and of course, valleys with rhododendrons the size of trees. It's just an amazing country. Now, of course, they've got huge challenges. They had no hardline telephones, no internet, and no television until 1999. And then suddenly the king opened that up, and now they have 190 channels of television, most from China and India. They have they leapfrogged over hardline telephones. They all carry cell phones, and they've got everywhere. When I was there last, everywhere I went, the hotels had internet, Wi-Fi. So they've exploded into the 21st century with all of the attendant problems that are coming with that. Young boys don't want to stay on the farm and work anymore. They want to go into the cities. They want to get a car. They want all that stuff that's being out there. So it'll be interesting to see whether Bhutan can withstand that tremendous pressure now that's coming from being outside. But they're offering us, I believe, this very, very important way of seeing ourselves in a different way. Theirs is a paradigm shift. And let me end by saying that's one of the reasons why Peter Robinson is leading the David Suzuki initiative to get a constitutional amendment and enshrine the right to a healthy environment in our Constitution. And I believe this is a very, very exciting initiative. And on its surface, you might think, well, who could be against having a healthy environment? Of course, we're all for that. But when you realize that a healthy environment means that our rivers and our lakes are intact, our forests remain intact, that we have to protect nature at all costs if we're going to have a healthy environment, there is going to be one hell of a fight. But in the process of this discussion, I believe we will have the arguments made that could lead us to a fundamental paradigm shift. At least that's my hope. And all of you that are involved in the parks, you are an absolutely critical part of this battle that is going to go on in the coming years. So thank you for doing what you're doing, and thank you for allowing me to share a few ideas with you.
In preparing for this, David had said that the most energizing and fun part for him was the questions.
Yes.
So we do have 2 microphones set up on either end of the corridor here. If you would like to pose a question to David, please just line up behind one of the microphones.
Get the lights on. I mean,
And we'll turn the lights up a bit in the house, please. Yes. So I'm going to turn over to you, David, and I'll help you.
Yep. Yeah, if I could get the lights on, because it's a black hole back in the audience there. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Oop, that's enough. Okay. So where are the mics? There's a mic there and a mic here, if there are any questions. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this lovely talk tonight. I had the privilege of leading a focus group in Indiana, where one of the questions to the group was, what do you think about climate change? And one of the respondents said, do you mean like humidity? So how can we have a paradigm shift when people are starting at that point where it's not a level playing field of understanding and coming to that table?
Yeah. Well, I think, in 1988, we were at the absolute height of understanding and concern about environmental issues, but also about global warming. 1988, a guy ran for president of the United States and said, if you elect me, I promise I will be an environmental president. Now, we have a number of Americans here. Where's the American table? And I'm wondering, do you know who that was? Barry Commoner? No. No, it was George H.W. Bush. There wasn't a green bone in his body, but he said it because the American people demanded it of him. 1988, Brian Mulroney was reelected to show he cared about the environment. He appointed his brightest star to be the Minister of the Environment. Now, the Canadians Lucien Bouchard. I interviewed Lucien 3 months after he was appointed, and I said, Mr. Bouchard, what is the most important issue you see facing Canadians? And right away his answer was global warming. And I said, how critical is it? He said, it threatens the survival of our species. We have to act now. 1988, Minister of the Environment. What happened? Mr. Bouchard decided separation of Quebec was more important than the survival of our species. Mr. Bush went on, and all kinds of things happened politically. But what happened most important is that the corporations began to spend tens of millions of dollars in a campaign of disinformation. So that even now, you have it's not a majority any longer, but you have a large segment of Americans that simply do not believe that climate change is going on. And I believe that is absolutely because of the amount of money that's been spent supporting people like the Drudge Report and all these guys and these Competitive Enterprise Institute and these right-wing think tanks that are all saying this is junk science. They jumped on this leak of 3,000 emails and call that climate gate. But this is all total bullshit that has been done, and in the process, undermining the credibility of scientists. Scientists have always been among the highest, had the highest esteem within society, certainly in Canada. But what's happening now is a very rapid decline in the credibility of scientists in the public. And I believe that underlies a tremendous amount of the so-called skepticism about climate. And it's tragic. It's really tragic. But I don't think it's worth it to get into a discussion. If people say, well, I don't believe it, then you just say, what's your evidence? How come you know this? How come you know that it's not real? When the vast majority of climate scientists who spent their entire professional lives studying it are already saying that we've got to do something about it right away. So, people cherry pick information. Oh, studies on the gas in Jupiter or sunspots or, just all this bogus stuff. Scientists lie all the time. And anyway, so I wouldn't get into the discussion.
David, the latest thing in the news you hear is the population increasing in the world. Do you think there is a maximum before we start to decrease? And how do we
Oh,
do
well,
that?
we already passed that a long time ago.
Yeah.
I asked Ed Wilson, how many people do you think the planet could sustain indefinitely? And he said, well, if you want to live like Canadians and Americans, 200 million. Now, that was a number he pulled off the top of his head. My own feeling is that's still too many. But, you know, even if you, and Americans and Canadians love population. They say, oh, yeah, it's those black, brown, and yellow people. They're breeding like flies. You know, that's the problem, is population. But of course, population is not just a matter of numbers. It's how much you use per person. You want to compare Canadians and Americans to Bangladesh, multiply by 80. And maybe you'll get an idea of what our impact is on a population basis. But yes, there are way too many of us, but we are, in the rich countries, the major predator. When 20% of the world's population is using over 80% of the world's resources, you know something's wrong. So we've got a twin challenge. We know what the best contraceptive is. We've learned from history. Educate women, give them a bit more financial security, and birth rates will drop. We know that. We've seen it in Kerala, in India. We've seen it in Indonesia. We have to focus on women and empower them with knowledge and a bit of financial stability.
Thank you.
But there are way too many of us. If we're not going to line people up and kill them, which you can't, then the big challenge right now is we are the ones that are taking the planet right down the wrong way. And that's through our hyperconsumption. It's the Walmartization of our society that is leading us right down the tube.
Hi. I've come to learn that the devastating effects of climate change tend to hurt the ones who are most poor and vulnerable, though they are not at the table in decision-making processes. So for those of us in the room who already have a place on the table, who are very close to it, what do you suggest that we can do to make space for them, make sure those voices are heard?
The reality is we have to look at ourselves, whether we're Americans and Canadians, and the reality is we don't give a shit about the disadvantaged people in other countries. How could we care about the other countries when we don't take care of our own people here? 1% of our population is grinding out all of the wealth, while you have the bottom half of the population barely making it. If we can't take care of our own people, do you think we're going to care about people in Vanuatu or any of these island states that are going to be submerged over the next decades? Of course not. We don't care, really. And, you know, we may be motivated when we see terrible effects of drought in Ethiopia or whatever, and we'll give a bit of money to help them out. But we won't do anything in a serious way if it threatens our way of life and our need to keep the economy growing and all that stuff. So I believe that the focus has got to be right here in the rich countries. We're setting the model for the rest of the world. And if we already keep going and saying the economy's got to grow, when are we ever going to say how much is enough? What's the economy for? Are we happier with all this stuff? And yet it's that drive just to have more stuff that is exploiting the entire planet, you know? So I think that we've got to focus right here and what kind of a society are we living in? Are we a society that cares for children, that cares about the future? I think that we should bring legal suits, and Americans are very litigious. I'd love to see Americans leading the way. We should be suing our political leaders for intergenerational crime. I think it's criminal to leave the planet in a mess. And there is a legal category called willful blindness. You know, you could plead, I don't know about it, but if you are willfully blind, where you should know something about it, you can be thrown in the slammer for that. I'd like to see Americans take their leaders to court on that basis. Intergenerational crime and willful blindness. And we sure as hell need it in this country because we're undermining 50 years of painfully acquired legislation, environmental legislation, with these 2 omnibus bills. And I think is there another omnibus bill coming up? No. Who knows?
Thank you.
Hi, David. My name is Farah, and I produce a yoga radio show in Vancouver. And I practice yoga as a path of nonviolence. And I'm very curious about the connections between spiritual values and the paradigm shift that you're talking about. And I know Bhutan is a Buddhist country, and I know that there are many values within yoga that are very much in line with having reverence for the planet that we live on. And I'm wondering what connection you see for the way that spiritual communities and people who have a spiritual path can contribute and be a part of the paradigm shift.
Well, it's absolutely essential. And I think that, we're not talking about formalized religion, but I think that we've got way too big for our britches. We think that the planet is ours to control and that we're going to manage it. I believe that when you have a sense of belonging to a much bigger system in which you're a part, where you don't know every component or understand it, there are huge forces impinging on us that we acknowledge are there. And that there are places, well, to me, the entire biosphere is sacred. We need that sense of sacredness. But I've been going through, I've been thinking of writing a long essay, and the way I see our present predicament is that we do not like to be reminded that we're animals. Because animals are wild and uncontrollable. And so we like to try to pull ourselves away from our biological roots. And one of the problems is women. Women bleed every month, and they remind us of our biological nature. And anyone who's ever witnessed a pregnancy and a delivery knows, man, oh man, that's nature in its rawest form, and we ain't in control. But it's not an accident, I believe, that more and more the physician is intruding so that cesareans and deliveries in these more heroic ways is increasing. And I think it's that attempt to become a part of that process and not let nature take over. And so we do that with agriculture, which was a real attempt to tame nature. But now we can actually tame them through genetic engineering, genetic modification. We want to design the world according to our specifications. And that's what came to me when I realized, oh my God, there are a lot of scientists now that are saying we've gone too far, it's too late to stop the climate change juggernaut. So we've got to now start geo-engineering the planet. We're going to take over the atmosphere and we're going to start engineering it so it's not harmful. This is the ultimate in hubris, and boy, do we need that spirit to understand our place.
Good evening, Dr. Suzuki. So I used to live in mountains and a more village area of this world, and I used to bike everywhere. But when I moved to Vancouver, I tried to bike. I live in Queensborough now, and I tried to bike to Vancouver. But there are so many problems that you find through the outside. And as he said, in order for us to save the nature, we have to fall in love with nature and find that nature is our true mother. So how do we escape this loophole? And people who live in Vancouver, the teens of Vancouver, how do they escape it and become environmentalists?
I missed the first part of your question. Are you saying this is about biking?
Yeah, and going outside.
Well, I think that's what these people are all here about, is to try to maintain those opportunities, and I hope expand those opportunities to experience nature. But in a city, you deliberately have to make the effort. Now, if you're complaining about bikes in Vancouver, my God, we've got a bike-friendly government now that we've never had. There are bike lanes going in everywhere. So we ought to be very happy about that and support this to the nth degree. Our problem, it's happening in Montreal and Toronto big time. Our problem in Vancouver is, we got hills. And I'm just too old to take the bloody hill up to my office. But there are ways around that. But I think that if you raise the issue of bikes, we should be tickled pink right now.
Thanks.
Dr. Suzuki, thank you very much for your talk tonight. I'm very interested in helping bring about the change in values that you've been speaking of. And I'm just wondering, what do you think is the best way to actually make this happen? Like imagine somebody, a city dweller who loves his TV and his car, and maybe he works an industrial job, was sitting in the crowd tonight and listening and thinking, wow, that makes sense, but does that mean if we value the environment over everything else, I have to give up my TV, I have to start living off the land, and well, I like my TV. How do we help these people see the bigger priorities, I guess?
Well, you know, people always say to me, well, if I'm going to listen to you and I believe what you're saying, do I have to go and live in a cave?
Yeah.
This is the immediate thing, you know, it's either this or it's that. Well, that's ludicrous. Mm-hmm. Of course, you know, you have to look at the way you're living. We are city dwellers, and cities have a lot of opportunity to reduce our footprint tremendously. The worst thing in the world would be for all of us to leave the city and try to go out onto the land and make a living. That would be terrible. But we have to find ways in which we can find our own happiness, our own real joy, without a lot of the stuff. And for young people, the thing I say is, I'm sorry, you can't just keep having, you know, go from Michael Jordan Nike shoes to LeBron's shoes, and, you know, like, no, I'm sorry, one pair of shoes ought to last you for life if they were made possible. There's not going to be an iPhone 20 and an iPad 60. I mean, this just can't go on that way. But it certainly does not mean going back and living this gruesome life of bare survival. But when you go to Bhutan, I'll tell you, living the way they do in a radical is not easy, especially when you've got used to living the way we do. But you know, we're living in such an unhealthy way. Can you imagine wanting to go to the store and jumping in a car to drive 3 blocks? I mean, this is stupid. We got, you know, and we do so much to allow us to own our own car. There's got to be better ways to do it than that. And I just think there are a lot of really simple things. I can see I can't go on answering questions all night. But let me tell you that the most important elder in my life was my father. And in 1994, he was dying. He was 85. And he had a form of cancer that was not painful. And I moved in to care for him the last month of his life. And that was one of the happiest times I ever spent with my father. My father was my big hero and mentor. But we laughed, we cried, my wife would come over every night with pictures of trips we'd taken together. And it was a wonderful time with my dad. Now, my father kept saying during that month, David, I'd die a rich man. He never had money. Tara and I were subsidizing him in his retirement, but he kept saying, I'd die a rich man. And the whole time we were together, he never once said, do you remember that closet full of wonderful clothes? Do you remember that 1988 Chev I had, or the house we owned on Broughdale Avenue in London? All we talked about were family, neighbors, and friends, and things we did together. And that was my father's wealth. It was people and things, experiences that he had with them. And in those things, he was truly a wealthy man. We've got off on this weird idea about what it is to be rich. And we think it's stuff and money. And yet what my father showed me is when he was dying, and he was not afraid of dying, he knew he was dying, the only things that mattered to him were those things he did with people that mattered to him, the experiences. So I think there's enormous opportunity. I know the vast majority of people today find themselves working their asses off. And they're very, very stressed. And so we've got to find ways of giving us much more time to spend together with family and stuff to do together. Not just fill up the opportunity for them to buy more stuff. Let's buy more experience with other people. We've just got to put our minds to it and get off this current kick, which is absolutely suicidal. We've got to keep the economy growing forever, which you can't.
Thank you very much.
I'll hide my iPhone now. I'm almost embarrassed after that.
I didn't say no iPhones, but...
David, do you see a correlation of the failure of the modern-day environmental movement to the failure of our political system and what we call now a democracy? Because democracy by representation is not taking place in our country or the United States. We can come to all kinds of consensus about we need clean air and clean food, and we all want healthy lifestyle and all the rest of it, but when it comes down to it, our leaders do not do what we ask them to do. In a political structure such as China or a dictatorship, where we can mandate certain things, isn't it much more efficient to be involved in that?
We've worked with dictators before. We had a project in the foundation working to protect an area in Tibet the size of Italy that was the area where 4 of the great rivers of Asia came from, the Salween, the Yangtze, what were the other 2? The Salween, Brahmaputra, and anyway, there are 4 of the great rivers. And we worked, and they were logging the heck out of the headwaters, and we worked with the Tibetan government. We had to be clandestine about talking to the Dalai Lama's people, but we talked to them, got their approval to work on ways, and it took 3 years of just, getting them to trust us, that we would work with the people in the headwaters to try to find alternatives to logging. And but once they trusted that we meant what we were saying, overnight the logging stopped. And that you can do when you've got a dictatorship.
That's right.
Yeah. But I believe that democracy is the best system we've got going. But democracy doesn't spring into being perfect. You always have to fight to get more of it. My mother and father were born and raised in Canada. And my dad in 1909, my mother in 1911. They were born and raised in Vancouver. They couldn't vote till 1948 because like all other Asians, African Canadians, and Aboriginals, we weren't allowed to vote. We take that for granted. And I don't know when women were enfranchised, but you don't have a perfect democracy. You always have to fight to get more of it. But when 40 to 50% of us aren't voting, you don't have a democracy anymore. And then when you allow corporations are not people. How is it corporations can invest in political candidates? What the hell is going on? They've got way more money than we have, but because they can invest vast amounts into political candidates, guess who gets first into the door when those guys are elected? It's corporations. Our government is operating on a corporate agenda. And the problem with that, of course, aside from the fact that the corporate agenda is not our agenda, and we've got to stop corporate contributions like that, which Mr. Chrétien did, and Mr. Harper then pulled that out. Chrétien put a limit on what corporations could put into political office, and that was stopped by the Harper government. And now, so we've got to reclaim democracy, but we have to get back out there as a society where everybody takes that responsibility seriously. We have a defective system with first past the post. Because my mom and dad were Canadians but couldn't vote because they were Japanese, you can bet when I reached voting age, I took the right to vote as not only a privilege but a duty. That was it was a sacred thing that I had to do because it's not easy. It's granted to us. I've voted in every election federally since I turned 21, and guess what? I've never voted for a government that got in power. So what the hell's the point when you have a first-past-the-post system? So we've got a big reform to come. But the difficulty we face is that we are now being driven by a corporate agenda and political agenda. Corporations now run on the basis of quarterly reports. And that doesn't leave much time for them to say, oh, what is the long-term impact of what we're doing? They're driven by the quarterly report. Politicians are driven by the next election. How can they make a commitment of billions of dollars every year if we're going to seriously deal with climate change? How can any politician say, if you elect me, I'm going to work to committing billions of dollars to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get us onto renewable for future generations? Future generations don't exist. You'd be laughed out of the arena. So the corporate agenda and the political agenda is too short. And that's why, if we believe in a democracy, I say every parent ought to be out there beating the bushes to say, I will vote for you if you're going to do something for my kids and my grandchildren. But that's the way it's got to be. We need democracy, and right now we don't have it. It's up to us to reclaim it, I believe.
Wow, thank you. I'd like to call on Councillor Gail Martin. You can bring the lights up, that's okay. I'd like to call on Councillor Gail Martin, the Vice Chair of our Environment and Parks Committee, to say a few closing words and thank Dr. Suzuki. Gail.
Another great presentation. Do you all agree? Yes. David, your presentation tonight was the finale of this year's Special Parks District Forum. And as you know, we have delegates here who are leaders in management of regional scale park systems from across North America. And again, we wanted the public to share in on this, and boy, did they share tonight. It's so great to see so many of you here. We have many guests, including residents of the region, who have an intense interest in the ecological health of the world that we live in. And many of the people sitting here tonight know that Metro Vancouver provides residents with access to some of the finest regional parks in the world. Tonight, with your closing remarks and your speech, David, it brings a close to the SPDF Speakers Series and the Special Parks District Forum. And David, on behalf of Metro Vancouver and the Capital Regional District, for the SPDF, the organizing committee, along with our many partners and guests, we'd like to thank you for your most interesting and stimulating talk and for leading us in the discussion tonight. Once again, to the public that came tonight, thank you very much for coming, and to all of those people that took part in the past 6 days at the Special Parks District Forum. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for coming to British Columbia. We'll see you all in California next year. Thank you very much.